I always thought if aliens finally boarded my rusted-out freighter, they'd want the raw titanium in the hold. Or maybe they'd just glass the ship for target practice. I didn't expect the docking seal to blow, tearing my life apart in a shower of sparks. Just so a 9FT Talmatriarch in biosuit armor could drag me onto her dreadnought. She didn't want my cargo. She didn't want my ship. She looked down at my bleeding, grease-stained face and said, "You will make an adequate husband for my daughter." The Marianas always smelled like burnt hair and cheap coffee. It was an old factory baseline that told you the life support scrubbers were working. If the smell ever faded, it meant the carbon dioxide was building up and you were about to take a very long permanent nap. I was waist deep in the secondary coolant manifold when the proximity klaxons went off. They didn't scream. They just choked out a metallic rhythmic stutter. Clack, clack, clack. My hand slipped. The crescent wrench cracked against a tungsten pipe, and the recoil sent a shock of white-hot pain up my wrist to the elbow. I swore a sharp exhalation off breath and scrambled backward out of the access hatch. The deck plates were already vibrating. Not the deep, steady thrum of my own fusion drive, but a high-frequency rattle that made my teeth ache. Something massive had just latched onto my hull. I didn't run to the weapons locker. The weapons locker had a rusted shotgun and 2 flares. You don't fight off a boarding party with a flare gun. You hide. I sprinted toward the smuggling compartments beneath the cargo bay. My boots slipped on a patch of hydraulic fluid, sending my knee crashing into the steel grate. Pain flared, hot and blinding, but panic is a hell of a drug. I tasted copper. My lungs burned. I dragged myself up and practically threw my body into the cramped meter-wide recess between the outer hull and the radiation shielding. I pulled the false panel shut just as the atmospheric pressure dropped. My ears popped painfully. The main airlock didn't cycle. It just tore. The sound of the breach was a deafening roar of escaping oxygen, followed instantly by the sickening heavy thud off the atmospheric shields snapping into place to plug the hull. Then came the footsteps. They were heavy, too heavy for boots on metal. It sounded like dense wet sandbags being dropped in rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. They were searching the ship. I curled into a tighter ball, my knees pressed against my chest. The compartment smelled like cold rat droppings and my own sour. Terrified sweat. My hands were shaking so violently I had to bite down on my own wrist to keep my teeth from chattering. I wasn't a soldier. I was a glorified truck driver hauling refined helium. The heavy footsteps paused right above my compartment. Don't look down. Don't look down. The metal grating above me screamed as it was peeled back. Not unbolted, peeled like the foil lid off a ration tin. Blinding harsh white light flooded darkness. I squeezed my eyes shut, throwing my arms up in a pathetic defensive reflex. A hand, if you could call it that, reached down. It was massive, wrapped in articulated bone-white armor that looked grown rather than manufactured. 3 thick digits wrapped around my entire torso. The air was driven from my lungs as I was hoisted upward. I tried to thrash, tried to swing a fist at the joint of the arm holding me, but it was like punching a concrete pillar. The alien didn't even flinch. It simply turned and carried me through the corridors of my own ship. My boots dangling a foot off the floor, they hauled me into the airlock. And then we crossed the threshold. The environment of their dreadnought hit me like a physical blow. The gravity was heavier here. It pulled at my skin, making my organs feel like lead weights. The air was thick, breathable, but laced with a scent that made my stomach churn. A sharp mix of raw ozone, crushed mint, and hot iron. I was dropped onto a polished obsidian-like deck. I hit the ground hard, scraping my cheek against the cold floor. I stayed there for a second, gasping, coughing up a small glob of spit and blood. Do not break it. The biometrics must remain viable. The voice didn't come from the air. It bypassed my ears entirely, echoing directly inside the wet cavity of my skull. A localized neural translator, broadcasting on a frequency that gave me an instant splitting headache. I pushed myself up onto my elbows. She stood at the end of the hall. She was easily 9 feet tall. Her body was a terrifying cascade of elegant predatory lines. She wore no helmet. Her face was distinctly alien, for eyes jet black and pupils set above a jawline that looked sharp enough to cut glass. Her skin was a pale iridescent gray. Yet, despite the terrifying inhumanity of her, the posture was universally recognizable, absolute unquestioned authority. The translator in my head hummed, attempting to localize her title and identity into something my primate brain could process. The word Regina surfaced in my mind. The Queen, you. The voice echoed in my skull again, perfectly modulated, utterly devoid of warmth. You will suffice. I blinked, a drop of sweat stinging my left eye. My knee throbbed. I wanted to say something defiant, something bold. Instead, I gagged, turned my head to the side, and dry heaved onto her immaculate floor. I woke up to the sensation of being swallowed. I thrashed violently, my eyes snapping open, but my limbs only met soft, yielding resistance. I wasn't tied down. I was lying on a bed, or rather a depression in the floor filled with a moss-like material that contoured perfectly to my body heat. It felt disturbingly biological, like lying on the tongue of some massive beast. I scrambled backward, pushing myself out of the recess and tumbling onto the solid deck. My breathing was ragged, shallow. I took stock. I was in a room devoid of corners. The walls curved smoothly into the ceiling, made of a pearlescent material that emitted a soft ambient glow. No visible lights, no visible doors, just a seamless egg-like chamber. My coveralls had been stripped off. I was wearing a loose, fitting gray tunic made of a fabric that felt uncomfortably like spun silk. You're awake. I jumped, spinning around. A section of the seamless wall had irised open. Regina stood there, up close. The sheer scale of her was suffocating. The ambient light caught the iridescent sheen of her skin. She didn't walk into the room. She glided, her movements unnervingly smooth for a creature of her mass. She was flanked by 2 guards in full armor, but she waved them back with a flick of her elongated 3-jointed wrist. The wall sealed behind her. What do you want? My voice cracked. I cleared my throat, trying to summon some scrap-off dignity, but it just sounded greedy and desperate. My ship is insured by the Corellia Transit Guild. If you ransom me, we do not require courtesy. Human. The localized translation in my head was female, aristocratic, and bored, and your vessel is currently being processed for scrap to feed the Dreadnought's forges. It is of no consequence. My chest tightened. The Mary Anna's 10 years of payments. My home gone. The anger flared. A hot spark in the cold terror. But I swallowed it down. Anger gets you killed. Then why am I alive? You don't take prisoners for fun. Regina moved toward the center of the room. The moss bed receded into the floor seamlessly, replaced by a smooth pedestal. She rested a hand on it. Your species is an anomaly, she began. The tone was academic, sterile. You are biologically crude. Your lifespans are tragically brief. Your physical strength is laughable compared to the apex predators of the Orion Spur. And yet, she turned her for black eyes on me. I felt exposed like a bug pinned to a corkboard. And yet, humanity possesses a genetic resilience that borders on the miraculous. You survive radiation pulses that would liquefy a Callan brain. You consume toxic vegetation for pleasure. You recover from kinetic trauma that shatters our bones. Your DNA is a chaotic, redundant, aggressively adaptable mess. I frowned, my fear momentarily muddied by confusion. Aryo, Aryo, are you going to dissect me? Dissection is useless. We require live integration. She folded her hands in front of her. The Callan royal bloodline is ancient, pure, but in our pursuit of purity, we have cornered ourselves. The genetic decay accelerating. My lineage suffers from autoimmune collapse, neurodegeneration, and a terrifying vulnerability to the common astral pathogens. We are dying, Micah. I froze. She knew my name. Of course she did. They probably downloaded the ship's registry before they ate it. You need a cure, I said slowly, piecing it together. You want to harvest my bone marrow, my blood. I want you to breed. She corrected smoothly. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I stared at her, my brain misfired, trying to process the translation. I'm sorry, I stammered, the absurdity breaking through the fear. You abducted me to run a breeding program. I abducted you to marry my daughter, Regina said, her tone hardening, brooking no further interruption. The integration of human resilience into the Callan royal line is our only path forward. We have calculated the viability. Your genetic markers indicate a 94% compatibility for cross-species fertilization via our splicing matrix. You will bond with her. You will provide the necessary biological anchor. In exchange, you will live a life of fab-out luxury, elevated far beyond the squalor of your miserable freighter. I can't. The words tumbled out of my mouth before I could stop them. We aren't even the same species. I don't even know how that would biologically work. You can't just force Regina close the distance between us in a fraction of a second. I didn't even see her move. One moment she was by the pedestal. The next she was towering over me. I stumbled back and hit the curved wall. She leaned down. The scent of crushed mint and ozone so thick it made my eyes water. Let me be unequivocally clear. Micah. Her voice was no longer a broadcast in my head. It was a physical vibration in the air, low and menacing. The translator caught up a millisecond later. This is not a negotiation. You are a biological necessity. You will court my daughter. You will bond with her. If you refuse or if you displease her, I will not simply kill you. I will subject you to the neural cleansers until your mind is a hollow shell, and we will extract your genetic material mechanically. Do you understand? My breath hitched. The copper taste was back in my mouth. My knees were shaking, a pathetic visible tremor I couldn't control. I wanted to spit in her face. I wanted to punch her. I wanted to be the hero in the vids. Instead, I looked down at the deck and nodded. Yes, excellent. She straightened up, the crushing pressure of her presence lifting slightly. Diana will arrive shortly. Make yourself presentable. She is delicate. The wall opened and Regina glided out. The seam closed, leaving me alone in the sterile, glowing egg. I slid down the wall until my rear hit the floor. I pulled my knees to my chest and buried my face in my hands. A wet, pathetic laugh bubbled up in my throat, turning into a dry sob. I was going to be forced into an alien marriage to save a dying bloodline. It was a sick joke. The universe was playing a sick joke on me. I spent the next hour pacing the perimeter of Therum. The soft fabric of the tunic clung to my cold sweat. I tried to find a seam in the wall, running my fingernails against the pearlescent surface until they arced. Nothing. I tried to punch the material, hoping to crack it, but it possessed a strange elasticity. It absorbed the kinetic energy of my fist, sending a dull, bruising ache up my forearm. While the wall remained unblemished, I rubbed my bruised knuckles. my cynical pragmatism finally starting to override the sheer panic. Okay, Micah, think. They needed me alive. They needed me functioning. I was a genetic anchor, whatever the hell that meant. If the Queen was to be believed, I was the only thing standing between her bloodline and extinction. That gave me leverage. Not much. Not enough to escape, but enough to not get immediately puried. But the daughter Diana, the name the translator had spat out, felt absurdly mundane. I pictured a younger version of Regina, cold, imperious, looking at me like I was a particularly ugly mud beetle, or worse, some feral monstrosity that was going to tear my head off if I looked at her wrong. The Queen had called her delicate. Coming from a 9-feet-tall tank of an alien, delicate could mean anything. Maybe she only weighed 600 pounds instead of 8. The soft chime of the door irising open interrupted my spiral. I spun around, pressing my back against the far wall, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. She stepped into the room. The translator, unprompted, whispered the designation into my mind again. Diana. She was tall. Yes, easily 7 feet, towering over my 6-foot frame. But where the Queen was built like a dreadnought, broad and imposing, Diana was painfully slender. Her skin shared thatsome pale, iridescent gray, but the scales that ran down her forearms and neck shifted with a subtle, oil-slick area of blues and purples. She was wearing what looked like ceremonial armor, plates of intricately carved bone-white material layered over dark flowing silks. But the armor didn't look like it fit right. It looked heavy. It dragged her shoulders down slightly. She had 6 eyes, not 4, 2 large, expressive black orbs, and 2 pairs of smaller secondary eyes situated just above her cheekbones. They blinked in staggered, nervous sequences. She stood frozen by the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her waist. The silence stretched. The door sealed shut behind her. I waited for her to bark an order. I waited for her to look at me with the same sterile disgust her mother had. Instead, she flinched, a full-body shudder. She looked away, fixing her gaze on the smooth floor. The rhythmic sound of her breathing filled the quiet room, shallow, quick, ragged. She smelled different from the Queen. The ozone was there, but the underlying scent was sharper, bitter, like crushed pine needles and cold rain. She was terrified. The realization hit me like a splash of cold water. My own panic dialed back, replaced by a sudden, jarring confusion. I wasn't looking at an apex predator demanding a mate. I was looking at a hostage. She started. Her voice wasn't the projected telepathy her mother used. It was spoken aloud, a complex series of soft clicks, low hums, and a melodic trill that my translator caller desperately scrambled to convert into English. I am sorry. The synthesized translation echoed in my ear. I petitioned the matriarch not to damage or vessel. I was informed you were extracted violently. I stared at her. My bruised knuckles throbbed. My chest still ached from where I'd been grabbed. I wanted to be angry at her. She was the reason my ship was gone. She was the reason I was trapped in a glowing egg wearing silk pajamas. But looking at her, watching her 6 eyes dart nervously toward me and then immediately snap back to the floor, watching her long multi-jointed fingers twisting the fabric of her silk robes, I couldn't muster the rage. She was trembling. Yeah, I rasped, my throat dry. Violently is one word for it. Diana flinched again at the sound of my voice. She took a half step back, pressing herself against the seamless wall. You are bleeding. I reached up and touched my cheek. It was crusted with dried blood from when I'd hit the deck. I wiped it on the sleeve of my tunic. It's fine. Humans leak. We're durable. Remember. Or so your mother tells me. The cynicism leaked out, harsh and biting. Diana's posture wilted further. The matriarch. She is pragmatic. She does not see the cruelty in her pragmatism. I did not wish for this. Sheffnally raised her head, her primary eyes locking onto mine. There was a depth of emotion there that transcended biology. Shame, exhaustion. Then why do it? I asked, pushing off the wall and taking a slow step forward. I kept my hands open, visible, instinctively, trying not to spook her. If you didn't want this, tell her no. A sad harmonicum vibrated in her throat before the translator caught it. To say no to the matriarch is to invite the void. I am the last viable heir. My brothers are dust. My sisters are ringtoned in stasis, their minds ruined by the genetic rot. If I do not bond, she swallowed, her throat working. The lineage ends. Trillions of lives depend on the stability of the throne. My desires are irrelevant. I stopped. She wasn't a monster. She was a kid. Well, the alien equivalent of phone, crushed under the weight of an entire civilization's expectations. And I was the band-aid they were forcing her to slap over a fatal wound. The sheer absurd tragedy of it all settled over me. My cynicism, usually my armor against the universe's cruelty, cracked. I let out a long, slow breath, running a hand through my messy hair. Right, I muttered. So, we're both prisoners. You're just in a slightly nicer cell. Diana looked at me, tilting her head. The smaller secondary eyes blinked rapidly. I suppose that is an accurate metaphor. I looked down at my hands. They were stained with old engine grease and dried blood. They shook slightly, but not from fear anymore, just adrenaline burnout. I looked back up at the towering alien princess who was shivering in her heavy armor. Amika, I said. I held out a hand. It was a stupid human gesture. She wouldn't know what it meant. I expected her to stare at it blankly, but Diana looked at my hand. Slowly, tentatively, she unclasped her hands. She reached out. Her arm was twice the length of mine, her skin cool and smooth, the scales feeling like polished obsidian against my palm. She didn't shake it. She just rested her long fingers gently against mine. Diana, the translator whispered. For the first time since the alarms went off on the Moranas, I didn't feel like I was going to die. I was still trapped. I was still terrified. But looking into those dark, anxious eyes, I realized I wasn't alone in the cage. The new quarters were an upgrade. If you considered living inside a giant polished pearl an upgrade, it was 5 times the size of my cell, split into 2 tiers by a sweeping handrailless ramp that made my acrophobia spike every time I looked at it. The air here was colder, deliberately chilled to mimic the high-altitude steppes of the Callan homeworld. It smelled less like ozone and more like wet slate, a damp, heavy cold that seeped through the thin silk tunic and settled straight into my marrow. My left knee, the one I'd smashed against the cargo grate during the breach, had swelled to the size of a grapefruit. It throbbed in time with the deep subaudible purr of the ship's primary reactors. You are staring at the perimeter sensors, Diana said. She was sitting on a low multi-tiered dais in the center of the lower room. She had shed the heavy bone-white ceremonial armor, revealing the true unsettling narrowness of her. Framed. Her shoulders were sharp, angular. Points. Her collarbones looked like twin obsidian rods. Beneath her gray shift. In her long 5-jointed fingers, she held a small crystalline prism, turning it over and over. It cast tiny fractured shards of green light across her face. I'm looking for the cameras, I said, leaning my back against a smooth pillar that felt uncomfortably warm, like human skin left in the sun. Your mother doesn't strike me as the trusting type. There are no optical recorders in these quarters, she replied. Her translator collar hummed. A low metallic vibration against her throat before the English words dropped into my ear. The matriarch relies on biochemical monitoring. The air scrubbers sample your exhalations every 3 seconds. They know your cortisol levels, your heart rate, your blood sugar. They know you are afraid. I'm not afraid. I lied. I wiped a line of cold sweat from my upper lip with the back of my hand. I'm hungry and my leg hurts like a Diana-Seth prism down. It hit the stone with a sharp musical tink. She rose, her seventh frame unfolding in sections like a praying mantis rising from the grass. She moved toward a recessed alcove in the wall and touched a glowing glyph. A small circular tray slid out. On it sat 2 vessels. One was a tall, slender vase made of frosted glass filled with a thick iridescent violet fluid. The other was a flat, shallow dish containing what looked like a lump of wet gray clay. She carried the tray over to me, her movements so fluid they lacked the familiar bounce and heel strike of human locomotion. It was like watching a shadow lengthen across a wall. "This is for you," she said, offering the dish of gray clay. "It has been synthesized from your ship's manifest records. It contains the necessary caloric and molecular inputs for your biology." I took the dish. It was heavy and it smelled faintly of stale yeast and wet cardboard. I scooped a bit up with my index finger and put it in my mouth. The texture was gluey, sticking to the roof of my mouth, tasting exactly like it smelled, unseasoned, industrial, and bleak. But my stomach gave a sharp, demanding growl. I swallowed it down, my throat muscles protesting the thick mass. "Delicious," I muttered, scraping another glob onto my finger. "Compliments to the chef." Diana watched me, her 6 eyes shifting in their synchronous patterns. The 2 large primary eyes stayed fixed on my face while the smaller upper pairs blinked rapidly, scanning my hands, my chest, the way my jaw worked. "Use sarcasm as a kinetic dampener," she observed. I stopped my finger halfway to my mouth. "A what?" "A dampener. When the internal pressure of your terror or anger reaches a critical threshold, your language alters. You state the opposite of reality to create a conceptual buffer. It is an inefficient cognitive loop." I let out a dry, hacking laugh that turned into a cough. The gray clay was stuck in my throat. I grabbed the frosted vase from the tray without asking and took a swig. Instantly, my vision went white. It wasn't water. It was incredibly hot, tasting like liquid pepper and vinegar. I dropped the vase. It shattered against the deck, the violet fluid hissing as it struck the warm stone, sending up a cloud of vapor that smelled like burnt matches. I fell to my knees, hacking, my eyes streaming with tears, my chest heaving as I tried to force oxygen back into my throat. "Micah." Diana was on the floor beside me in an instant. Her cold, scaly hands gripped my shoulders. Her touch was shockingly strong, her fingers digging into my trapezius muscles with enough force to bruise. "Do not inhale the vapor," she urged, her voice losing its melodic trill, becoming a harsh, urgent sequence of clicks. "The fluid is an amino acid concentrate for my species. It is highly acidic to your tissue. I should have warned you. I did not think you would reach for it. Should have told me." I wheezed, my voice a ragged whisper. I pressed the palm of my hand against my burning chest. My stomach felt like I'd swallowed a lit road flare. "Jesus Christ, Diana, you trying to finish what your mother started?" She pulled her hands back as if my skin had burned her. She sat back on her haunches, her long arms draped over her knees, her primary eyes wide and dark. "No," she said softly through the translator. "I am clumsy. I am not used to things that break so easily." I stayed on my hands and knees for a long time, watching the violet fluid evaporate into the floor tiles until only a faint discolored stain remained. My heart was thumping a panicked, erratic rhythm against my ribs. My throat felt raw, flayed. But as I looked up at her, at the way her slender shoulders had hunched inward, the way her secondary eyes had gone entirely still. A sign of Callan distress I was beginning to recognize. The anger drained out of me. I was a grease monkey from a third-tier colony world. She was the heir to an empire that spanned 3-star systems, and yet, we were both just sitting on the floor of a luxurious cage, terrified of making a sound that might bring the keepers running. I wiped my nose, which had started to bleed a little from the chemical fumes, and dragged myself back up to a sitting position, my bad knee sticking straight out. "Hey," I said, my voice rough, "don't sweat it. Humans are like cockroaches. We're hard to kill, even with battery acid." She didn't answer. She just picked up the crystalline prism again, her fingers tracing its sharp edges in the dark. The summons didn't come from Regina. It came from the Grand Arbiter. His name was Gideon, a title the translator insisted on rendering with a heavy religious weight. He didn't use the localized telepathy the Queen favored. He spoke through a massive floating copper disc that hovered 3 inches off his left shoulder, translating his deep guttural rumbles into a voice that sounded like grinding tectonic plates. We were brought to the high tire, a vast open amphitheater that looked out over the Dreadnought's primary construction bays. Below us, through miles-wide panes of transparent structural carbon, the skeleton of a new capital ship hung in the void, surrounded by swarms of worker drones that looked like angry silver bees. The light from their welding torches flared in rhythmic, blinding bursts of blue and violet, casting long, jerky shadows across the amphitheater. Gideon was older than Regina. His skin had lost its iridescent sheen, turning a dull, chalky white, and the scales along his neck were cracked and pitted with age. He sat in a high back chair made of fused bone, his 4 eyes milky with cataracts, but still sharp enough to trace my movements with a predatory intensity. Diana stood 3 paces behind me. She was back in her ceremonial armor, but she was vibrating. I could hear the faint metallic rattle of her shoulder plates clicking against each other. The matriarch grows desperate. Gideon's translator disc boomed. The sound hit me in the center of my chest, a physical vibration that made my ribs ache. To bring a bipedal rodent into the high house, to suggest that our ancient blood, the blood that conquered the melanic clouds, should be diluted with the mud of a world that has not yet seen its own sun die. I didn't say anything. I stood there, my hands clasped behind my back, trying to keep my weight off my swollen knee. I'd learned early in my shipping days that when a Port Authority official is trying to provoke you, you don't give them a target, you just become a wall. He is not a rodent, Diana said. Her voice was thin, but it held a stubborn, resonant chord that surprised me. His genetic line possesses the structural resilience our engineers have failed to synthesize. The matriarch has verified the compatibility. Gideon let out a sound like a dry cough. The copper disc translated it as a cold rhythmic chuckle. Compatibility on parchment is not compatibility in the blood. Child, Gideon rumbled. He leaned forward, his massive 3-jointed hands resting on his knees. The human looks soft. He leaks fluid from his eyes when the air turns sharp. He limps. Look at his left lower limb. It is failing him after a minor structural impact. He turned his milky eyes toward a terminal on his armrest. Let us see how this resilience handles the reality of our world. Before I could process the words, the air around me changed. The gravity plates beneath my boots didn't just increase their pull. They slammed me down. It felt as if a 300-pound sack of wet sand had been dropped directly onto my shoulders. My bad knee gave out with a sickening wet pop. I hit the deck plates hard, my chin bouncing off the stone, my teeth cutting deep into the inside of my lip. The blood tasted hot and salt heavy. Double quotes Micah. Double quotes Diana moved a step forward, but the heavy armored guards, their bone-white pikes crossed, barred her path. Their armor whined as they increased their own internal gravity stabilizers to compensate for the room shift. Stand down, Princess, Gideon commanded. If he is the anchor your lineage requires, he will not break under to standard Callan gravities. This is the weight of our cradle world. This is the air our ancestors breathed when we hunted the great leviathans. The pressure increased. My lungs felt like they were being squeezed between 2 sheets of lead. Every time I tried to inhale, my chest could only expand a fraction of an inch before the weight forced the air back out of my throat in a ragged, pathetic wheeze. My vision began to narrow, the edges turning a fuzzy, vibrating black. The light from the welding torches below became a single blinding smear of purple. Get up, my brain screamed, but it wasn't a heroic thought. It was pure animal panic. If I stayed down here, my ribs were going to crack. They were going to puncture my lungs, and I was going to drown in my own blood on a clean floor while an old alien watched. I screamed. It wasn't a warrior's cry. It was a high, ugly, desperate sound, a release of pure unadulterated terror. I dug my fingernails into the microscopic seams of the deck plates. One nail snapped, tearing back to the quick, leaving a streak of dark red on the white stone. I didn't care. I shoved my right foot down the good leg and forced my hips up. My spine made a series of loud, terrifying cracking noises as the vertebrae compressed. My left leg was useless, trailing behind me like a dead weight, but I dragged it. I pushed with my arms, my muscles shaking so hard they felt like they were liquefying. I looked up at Gideon. My eyes were bloodshot, the capillaries in my eyelids having popped from the pressure. A thick line of dark blood was leaking from my left nostril, dripping down my chin and onto the front of my silk tunic. I looked like a half-crushed dog in the middle of a transit highway, but I was looking at him. Is that all? I choked out. The words were barely a whisper, muffled by the blood in my mouth. Muffled by the blood in my mouth. But the translator caller picked them up and spat them out in a sharp, defiant electronic squeak. My old freighter had worse atmospheric shifts when the cargo bay UNCOUPLED. It was another lie. The Marianas had excellent artificial gravity, but the cynicism was the only weapon I had left. Gideon stared at me. His milky eyes didn't widen, but the scales along his jaw flitted slightly, a subtle twitch of surprise. He looked at my broken fingernail, at the blood on the floor, and then back at my face. With a flick of his finger, the pressure vanished. The sudden release of gravity was almost worse than the onset. 41 to 4,841 minutes. 48 seconds. My heart raced, pumping blood furiously into vessels that were no longer compressed, sending a violent, dizzying rush to my head. I fell sideways, my shoulder hitting the deck, coughing violently, spraying dark drops of blood across the polished stone. He is crude, Gideon said, his voice flat, his copper disc translating without emotion. He is ugly, but he doesn't shatter. He waved his hand, a gesture of dismissal. Take him away. Prepare him for the bonding ritual. If he survives the integration, we will see if his offspring inherit his stubbornness. Diana didn't wait for the guards to clear. She shoved past their crossed pikes, her long limbs moving with a frantic, uncharacteristic desperation. She dropped down beside me, her cold hands sliding under my arms, hoisting me up with a strength that felt both terrifying and entirely necessary. I didn't try to stand on my own. I let her bear my weight, my head lolling against their armored shoulder, the sharp smell of her pine and rain scent mixed with the metallic tang of my own blood. As she carried me out of the amphitheater, away from the milky eyes of the Grand Arbiter, I closed my eyes and let the blackness finally take me. I woke up to the sound of dripping water. It was a slow, rhythmic drip, 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 coming from the small wash basin in the corner off our quarters. The ambient light had been lowered to a dull, deep amber, Theclan equivalent of twilight. My left leg was straight, encased in a hard, translucent gel sleeve that hummed with a low, warm vibration. The pain wasn't gone, but it had been dulled to a distant thick ache, like a toothache in my knee. My chest was wrapped in a tight fibrous bandage that smelled strongly of sulfur and dried mud. Diana was sitting on Thefler beside the moss bed. She had taken off her gauntlets, and her long bare hands were resting on her lap. She wasn't turning the crystal prism this time. She was just staring at my chest, watching the slow, shallow rise and fall of my ribs. You should have let them use the mechanical extraction, she said. Her voice was very quiet, the translatorling the words in a flat monotone whisper that didn't match the tremor in her hands. I took a careful breath. The sulfur bandage tightened around my ribs, keeping them from expanding too far, preventing the sharp stabbing pain of the deep bruises. Mechanical extraction. You mean the part where they hollow out my brain and take my marrow with a pump? Yes. I'm old-fashioned. Diana, I rasped, my throat still feeling like it had been scrubbed with wirewool. I prefer to keep my brains inside my skull. It's where I keep all my bad ideas. She didn't laugh. She didn't even blink. Gideon would have killed you if you had broken. He wanted you to break. He wanted to prove to the matriarch that humanity is too fragile to save us. Why does he care? I asked, turning my head toward her. The movement made the back of my neck stiffen up. If your people are dying, shouldn't he be happy someone's throwing you a lifeline? Even if that lifeline is a broken-down mechanic. Diana reached out. Her long index finger hovered an inch above my wrapped chest, as if she wanted to touch the injury, but was afraid the mere proximity of her hand would cause more damage. Because we were gods, Micah, she whispered. The translator trilled softly, struggling with the emotional nuance of her words. For 10,000 solar cycles, the Kellen did not adapt to the universe. We made the universe adapt to us. We engineered our children to be perfect. We cleared away the genetic trash, the mistakes, the redundancies, the mutations. We thought we had built a temple. She pulled her hand back, curling her fingers into a tight fist. But a temple is rigid. A temple cannot move when the ground shifts. My older sister, Sophia, she was beautiful. Her skin was so pure it was almost transparent. Her mind could calculate orbital trajectories which hit a terminal. Diana's primary eyes clouded over, a thin milky film sliding across them before she cleared it away with a sharp blink. When she reached her 20th cycle, her neural pathways began to misfire. Her perfect brain forgot how to signal her heart to beat. Then my brother Peter, his bones became porous. They turned to chalk within 3 moons. We are not dying from a disease, Micah. We are dying because we have nowhere left to go inside our own code. We are a house with no doors. I looked at her, the cynicism that usually protected me feeling incredibly heavy, incredibly useless. I thought about my home colony on New Castle. It was a miserable rock. The water was bitter with sulfur. The soil was 90% clay, and the local fauna spent half its time trying to burrow into the colony's insulation lines. Everything broke. The tractors broke. The air scrubbers broke. The people broke. But we had duct tape. We had weld patches. We had this messy, ugly habit of taking to broken things and slamming them together until they worked long enough to get us through the winter. My world was dirty, I said, my voice dropping to match the quiet of the room. We didn't have temples. We had scrap heaps. If something didn't break at least once a month, we assumed it was broken already, and we just hadn't noticed. I reached out from beneath the silk sheet. My hand was pale, covered in small silver scars from old wrench slips, my fingernails still black and split from the amphitheater floor. I didn't try to hold her hand. I just laid my palm flat on the deck plates between us, open and still. Your mother thinks my DNA is a miracle, I said. It's not. It's just a history of every bad thing that ever happened to my ancestors, recorded in grease and bone. We're survivors because we're too stupid to know when we're beaten. Diana looked down at my hand. Slowly, the long multi-jointed fingers of her hand uncurled. She didn't rest her hand on top of mine this time. Instead, She aligned her long fingers parallel to mine, her skin just a hair's breadth away, close enough that I could feel the strange dry heat radiating from her scales. The bonding ritual is in 3 cycles, she said, her secondary eyes blinking in a slow rhythmic pattern that felt almost peaceful. It will be performed before the High Council. They will monitor our bio readings during the integration. If your heart stops or if my body rejects the genetic splicing matrix, it won't stop, I said, closing the small gap between her fingers, letting my rough human skin press against the cold, smooth edge of her hand. I told you, Diana, I'm a very stubborn bastard. She didn't pull away. Outside the pearl-like walls, the deep subaudible purr of the dreadnought continued its heavy, relentless thrum. Relentless thrum. Warning. Structural failure in the primary code. The drone sputtered. Human anomalies are overriding Cal and DK sequences. Redundancy protocols. Activating. My vision faded to a narrow, dark tunnel. The last thing I felt was the intense burning heat radiating from Deanna's hand, finally matching my own. I held on until the tunnel collapsed entirely, dragging me down into the quiet dark. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the sharp ozone of the dreadnought or the sterile bleach of the matrix chamber. It smelled like sweat, stale copper, and the faint, bitter scent of crushed pin needles. I opened my eyes. The ambient light was a soft dim gold. I was lying in the moss bed in our quarters. The heavy compression bandage around my ribs was gone, replaced by Athen, dark silk shirt. I shifted my weight. The deep grinding pain in my bones had receded to a dull, exhausted ache, like I'd just worked a 40-hour shift hauling cargo crates in high grav. I flexed my left. The knee popped. A wet, ugly sound, but the agonizing throb was gone. You have been unconscious for 40 to standard hours. I turned my head. Diana was sitting on the edge of the disk, facing away from me. She wasn't wearing her heavy armor. She wore a simple dark tunic. I pushed myself up on my elbows. My arms shook violently, the muscles feeling like overstretched rubber bands, but they held. I looked at my right forearm. The jagged tear from the restraints had already sealed, leaving behind a thick raised scar. But the scar wasn't the pale pink of human tissue. It had a faint, subtle, iridescent purple sheen to it. Did it work? I asked. My voice sounded like a shovel dragging across gravel. Diana turned around. The breath caught in my throat. She looked different. She was still painfully slender, her face still sharply alien, but the fragility was gone. The pale, almost translucent quality of her skin had been replaced by a deeper, more solid gray, flushed with a subtle, dark warmth beneath the surface. Her chest rose and fell in a steady, deep rhythm, no longer the shallow, erratic panting of a terrified bird. She wicked over to the moss bed. She didn't glide with that unnerving shadow-like smoothness anymore. There was a slight heavy heel strike to her step now, a grounded weight. She sat on the edge of the recess, looking down at me. Gideon demanded your immediate execution, she said, her voice lacking the musical trill it used to have. It was lower now, slightly rougher. The translator didn't even need to work as hard to capture the cadence. He claimed the bonding was a failure. Said you had corrupted the pure code, that you had infected the royal line with your dirt. And your mother, he grunted, dragging myself up until my back rested against the curved wall. 1 hour 6 minutes and 47 seconds, the matriarch reviewed the blood panels. Diana looked down at her hands. She flexed her fingers. The joints looked thicker, less like fragile glass and more like heavy carbon fiber. My autoimmune collapse has halted. The neurodegradation sequences have been overwritten by chaotic, meaningless filler DNA. It is inefficient. It is ugly, but it holds. She looked back upon me, all 6 of her eyes locking onto mine. We are married, Micah. I let out a slow, heavy breath. The reality of it settled over me, heavy and inescapable. There was no registry, no rings, no drunken dancing at a reception hall. There was just a shared scar, a muddy genetic code, and the terrifying knowledge that we were permanently, biologically anchored to one another. So, what now? I asked, looking around the gilded cage. We just stay in this room and wait for the rest of your empire to realize that perfect princess is running on duct tape and human panic. Diana didn't smile, but the muscles around her jaw tightened in a way that felt distinctly, surprisingly human. No, she said quietly. Gideon will not accept this. There are factions within the High Council who would rather see the empire burn to ash than be ruled by a corrupted bloodline. The matriarch protected us today, but she is old and her pragmatism extends only as far as my viability. She reached out, her long fingers tracing the iridescent scar on my forearm. Her touch wasn't cold anymore. It was warm. Human warm. My world was a temple. Micah, she whispered. But you were right. Temples break when the ground shifts, and the ground is shifting. I looked at the alien princess who had abducted me, terrified me, and nearly killed me. I saw the dark bruises under her eyes, the heavy exhaustion in her shoulders, and the stubborn, undeniable pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. We weren't a fairy tale. We were 2 broken pieces of machinery slammed together in the dark to keep the ship from tearing itself apart. I placed my hand over hers, pressing her warm palm against my scarred arm. Let him try to break us, I said, my cynical edge returning. But this time, it wasn't a defense mechanism. It was a promise. I'm a mechanic, Diana, and there isn't a damn thing in this universe I can't patch up if I have to. And that's the brutal, unvarnished truth of Micah and Diana's union. Not a romance born of stars, but a survival pact forged in blood, pain, and the stubborn human refusal to die quietly. Now bound by a chaotic genetic splice. The grease monkey and the alien princess must face a high council that wants them dead and an empire on the brink of civil war. Can their messy patched-together biology survive the lethal politics of the Callan elite? If you love this deeply grounded, gritty take on sci-fi survival and alien politics, hit that like button, share the video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next saga.